On the morning of the St. Giles summer fete, the village of Little Brabham awoke to bunting and speculation. It was the sort of day that should have belonged to sponge cakes, raffles, and elderly ladies in floral frocks. The vicarage lawn, usually sedate and faintly disapproving, had been transformed into a cheerful chaos of trestle tables and striped tents. Children raced about in varying states of stickiness, a brass band tuned up with gloomy determination, and at the very edge of it all, under a white awning, stood the exhibit that everyone had been whispering about for weeks. Lady Agnes Chislehurst's famous doll's house. "It's indecent, that's what it is," declared Mrs. Emmeline Pierce, the postmistress, adjusting her hat to a more critical angle. "A grown woman of her age and all that money, and she spends it on toys." "It's not a toy," said Mr. Lionel Briggs, the bank manager, puffing out his chest with the satisfaction of one who has seen the doll's house by special invitation. "It's a model, an architectural miniature. Lady Agnes said it's insured for £5,000. £5,000 sank into the listening crowd like a stone into a pond. Miss Jane Marple, sitting on a folding chair beneath a laburnum tree, did not join in the exclamations. She merely blinked very slightly and smoothed the cuff of her pale blue cardigan. £5,000 was a good deal of money, even nowadays. People did rather odd things for far less. From her vantage point, a place chosen for shade and, incidentally, for its excellent view of the comings and goings, Miss Marple watched Lady Agnes receiving her admirers. She was a thin, handsome woman in late middle age, stiff-backed in cream linen, with the look of someone who has been obeyed for a long time and finds it only natural that she should continue to be so. "Ah, Miss Marple," said the vicar's wife, bustling over, cheeks glowing with effort and goodwill. "Do come and see the doll's house before the queue grows any longer. It really is quite remarkable. Every tiny thing works." "So I am told, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "I shall go presently. I always think there is a great deal to be learnt by watching people before they expect one to be looking at them." Mrs. Dane smiled vaguely, not entirely following this, and hurried off to scold a boy who was attempting to eat his coconut shy prize before it had been paid for. Presently, the bell from the coconut shy was joined by the clink of teacups, the sudden shrieks of the children's three-legged race, and the hum of polite rivalry around the cake stall. Under the awning, the queue to view the doll's house lengthened. There were comments on the tiny carpets, the electric light in the miniature chandeliers, and the perfect reproduction of Lady Agnes's own drawing-room. "But why?" asked Mrs. Pierce, lowering her voice to a stage whisper. "Must there be a nursery in it, if she's never had children?" Such questions interested Miss Marple more than the answer. People revealed themselves most clearly when they were speculating about others. She rose at last, and with an apologetic smile for her slightly stiff joints, joined the end of the queue. Ahead of her, Major and Mrs. Potts were discussing the forthcoming parish council elections with a bitterness that suggested old quarrels. Behind her, a young woman with anxious eyes and ink-stained fingers twisted her handbag strap. Miss Marple recognized her as Alice Barton, Lady Agnes's new companion. "You must be very proud of it, my dear," Miss Marple said gently over her shoulder. Alice started. Oh, yes. Her ladyship is, certainly. She's worked on it for years. It's very important to her." There was something in the way she spoke that made Miss Marple glance back more closely. Alice's fingers had gone quite white around the strap. "Such things often are," Miss Marple murmured. "People put a great deal of themselves into their hobbies." They had just reached the entrance to the awning when it happened. A cry, sharp and utterly unlike the afternoon's previous laughter, tore across the lawn. It came from within the tent, high, strangled, and followed by the crash of something overturned. The queue froze. Then, like corn before a scythe, it parted to make way for the vicar and Mr. Briggs, who rushed inside. Miss Marple did not hurry. She stepped forward with practiced care, noting, as she passed, that Alice Barton had gone quite grey about the lips. Inside, the heat of many bodies pressed against the scent of polish and new wood. The doll's house stood at the center on its specially built table. Its tiny front swung open to reveal the minute rooms within. In the perfectly reproduced drawing room, sprawled upon a Lilliputian hearthrug, lay a little doll, newly added, its painted face downwards. And on the real vicarage carpet at Miss Marple's feet, terribly still amidst the overturned chair and shattered teacup, lay Lady Agnes Chislehurst. The first rumours began, as so many things in St. Mary Mead did, in the queue at the High Street grocer's the following morning. By then, the bare facts had travelled very fast indeed, Mrs. Eleanor Alderley, found dead in the vicarage garden during the charity fete, slumped beside the great Victorian doll's house that had so delighted the ladies' committee. Heart failure, some said. Poison, others whispered with an almost hopeful relish. Murder, said Mrs. Price Ridley, with a certain grim satisfaction, as though the village had been falling behind its proper quota of sensational occurrences. Of course, she observed loudly. A woman of her age has no business wearing that shade of red. It's practically an invitation to, well, anything. Miss Hartnell sniffed. She was not what I should call a settled woman. Very flighty. That hair, for instance. Too much attention to appearance is never a good sign. At the rear of the little queue, Miss Marple bent slightly over her shopping basket, ostensibly counting out her coupons, her mild blue eyes lowered. No one would have said that she listened. In fact, she heard everything. Poison, repeated Mrs. Price Ridley. I heard it from Mrs. Calthrop's maid, who heard it from the doctor's boy. They sent for Sir Henry Clithering's man, didn't they? That Scotland Yard person. Well, they would not do that for mere heart failure. Inspector Lake, murmured Miss Marple gently. He was at the fete, you know, a very nice young man. He seemed very much surprised. She did not add that she had watched him the previous afternoon. Saw his quick, appraising glance at the glass of homemade lemonade still on the table beside Mrs. Alderley's chair, its surface faintly clouded and sticky. Nor that she had noticed, as perhaps no one else had, the faint ring of moisture on the painted floor of the doll's house drawing room, as though from a tiny, recently removed glass. Details. Small things. They had always interested her. Outside, the morning was bright and very peaceful. The fete marquee had been taken down, leaving squares of paler grass on the vicarage lawn. A few confused paper flags still fluttered, forgotten in the hedges. Miss Marple, returning home with her modest shopping, paused by her little front gate and looked thoughtfully at the neat borders, the roses, the orderly propriety of it all. Violence slipped into such settings so quietly. She had seen Mrs. Alderley only twice before the fete. Once sweeping into the little tea shop with a cloud of French scent and a feathered hat that drew every eye. Once seated rather tensely at the back of the church, her gloved hands tightening on her handbag when the vicar spoke of repentance. A woman, Miss Marple thought, who had lived in places where reputation could be mended simply by going somewhere else. London, perhaps, or abroad. Pretty, still in a brittle, careful way, the sort of prettiness that is always conscious of time. At 3 o'clock precisely, as the village clocks chimed with their usual obstinate disunity, Inspector Lake called at the little white house on the lane. He looked, Miss Marple thought, a trifle more harassed than he had the previous afternoon. I hope I am not disturbing you, Miss Marple. He cleared his throat. I wondered if you would be so kind as to tell me what you observed yesterday. You have such an excellent memory for small points. Not at all, Inspector. Do sit down. I have just made some tea. It is so much easier to remember things over a proper cup, I always think. She poured for him, neat, unhurried, as he produced his notebook with an air of apology. He began with the ordinary questions, where she had been standing when the scream came, what she had done, whom she had seen near the summer house, that little wooden folly where the doll's house had been set up on a trestle table, commanding so much admiring attention. You are sure, said Lake at last, frowning, that the glass of lemonade on the table was not there earlier? "Quite sure," said Miss Marple serenely. "Mr. Alderley was drinking barley water before the judging. I noticed because my niece always says barley water is so good for one's figure, and very few ladies listen to that sort of advice. I did not see the lemonade until afterwards." Lake's pencil moved. "And you did not see who brought it?" "No, Inspector. But I saw who didn't," she added gently. He looked up, surprised. "Didn't?" "Yes, Mrs. Alderley's maid, for instance. She was occupied quarrelling with that young man from the garage. She behind the coconut chassis. And at Penrose, the solicitor. He was far too busy losing his temper over the tombola prizes." "I see," said Lake slowly. "You're telling me that several of the obvious people could not have done it." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple vaguely. "One never tells, Inspector. One only notices." But when he had gone, her face grew quite grave. For there was one other thing she had noticed and had not quite deliberately mentioned. The tiny, perfect china figure from the doll's house nursery. A red-haired lady in a crimson gown had been lying on its side when they found Mrs. Alderley. Later, as they all stood about, it had disappeared, and people did not usually steal toys at a church fete. Inspector Graves arrived at the Grange early the next morning, though not so early that the villagers of Little Brenton had not already dissected the entire tragedy over breakfast tables, over garden fences, and, in one case, over the hedge between the post office and the butcher's yard. At the Laurels, Mrs. Weatherby's neat red brick house, Miss Marple sat opposite her hostess at a small round table by the window. The morning paper lay neglected. Mrs. Weatherby vastly preferred the more colourful account she had received from Ethel, her maid, who had it directly from her cousin's husband, man who occasionally swept the station platform and therefore knew everything. "So there it is, Jane," Mrs. Weatherby concluded, pouring fresh tea with a little tremor which she would certainly have denied noticing. "Stabbed in the back with one of Sir Lionel's own paper knives, they say. I always said that man Hargreaves would come to a bad end. Solicitors invariably do, in my experience. They know far too much about everyone." Miss Marple, arranging a strip of marmalade neatly on her toast, made a small vague sound that might have been a scent. "And to think," Mrs. Weatherby went on, "that wretched little doll was lying there first. Positively prophetic. Ethel says the child, that Turner girl, began screaming so loudly that Sir Lionel actually swore in front of everyone. Ethel noticed because Sir Lionel always tells the servants not to use strong language. Hypocritical, I always say. People are apt to forget their principles when they are frightened," Miss Marple observed mildly. "It is very natural, and Sir Lionel must have been very much disturbed indeed." "Frightened, you mean?" Mrs. Weatherby sniffed. "Oh, he knows something, depend upon it. There was that matter of the land by the river. Ethel says Mr. Hargreaves and Sir Lionel were in the library alone for nearly half an hour before tea, and that when they came out, Sir Lionel looked as if he'd bitten into a green apple." Miss Marple did not inquire how Ethel could possibly know how long they had been in the library. She had a shrewd idea that time, in the minds of maids, was elastic and adapted itself cheerfully to the requirements of a good story. "And Miss Denton?" Miss Marple asked. "The lady who made the doll's house?" "Shut up in her cottage with a headache," said Mrs. Weatherby. "Dr. Rowe saw her last night. Ethel says she was quite beside herself. Well, naturally. It is not every day your handiwork becomes, what do they call it? An omen of murder. Very unhealthy for the nerves. And entirely unsuitable, if you ask me. All those tiny tables and saucepans, idolatrous." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes rested reflectively on the neat flower beds outside, where Mrs. Weatherby's gardener had marshaled marigolds into prim rows like a platoon. "Imitation is always a little disturbing," she said. "It makes people feel they are being watched. I remember when Mrs. Simpkins in St. Mary Mead had that waxwork made of her late husband for the parlour. It was most conscientiously done by a cousin in Weston-super-Mare. But it upset a great many people, and in the end she had to put it in the attic. Though, she added thoughtfully, no one was murdered on that occasion. A firm knock at the front door interrupted any reply. A moment later Ethel appeared, face pink with importance. "Inspector Graves to see you, ma'am. From Melchester. About yesterday." The inspector was a thick-set man with iron-grey hair and a manner of cautious patience, as if he expected everyone to try to mislead him and was resigned to dealing with it. He greeted Mrs. Weatherby with suitable respect and bowed slightly to Miss Marple, whom he had met once before in circumstances he did not like to remember too clearly. "Just a few questions, Mrs. Weatherby," he said. "You and Miss Marple left the garden about 5:30, and—" "I am sure I don't remember exact times," Mrs. Weatherby protested. "We walked down with Mrs. Blake and that schoolteacher, Miss Reed. You recall, Jane?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "We left just after the blind man's buff game began. The children were getting rather overexcited. I should think it was nearer 20 past, Inspector, because the church clock had not yet struck the half-hour as we went by." Inspector Graves glanced at her sharply, then made a brief note. "You did not see Mr. Hargreaves after that, ma'am?" "No, he was standing on the terrace with Sir Lionel, looking rather cross, I thought." "Sir Lionel, not Mr. Hargreaves?" Mr. Hargreaves was smiling, but in the way people do when they are not really pleased at all. A little too many teeth. Graves's pencil paused. "And the doll's house, Miss Marple? You examined it before you left?" "Oh, yes. It was most ingenious. The little drawing room was particularly charming, though I do not think Miss Denton has ever seen it proper scullery. She had made it altogether too dainty." "You noticed the figure, the doll representing Mr. Hargreaves?" Miss Marple hesitated just perceptibly. "I noticed a figure lying on the floor, but I did not recognize it as any particular person. Dolls, you know, often resemble more than one original, like family photographs." Graves grunted. It had been pointed out to some of the guests as Mr. Hargreaves, the moustache and a little roll of papers in its hand. No doubt about it. And it was lying in exactly the same way as the deceased when we found him. That is a curious thing, Miss Marple." "It is," agreed Miss Marple gently. "Very curious indeed. Because that must mean that someone had already thought about Mr. Hargreaves being dead. And people do not usually imagine such things about their friends without a reason." Graves fixed his eyes on her. "You think it indicates premeditation, then?" "Oh, I dare say the law would call it that," Miss Marple said vaguely. "In my experience, Inspector, people very seldom do anything altogether without having thought about it first. Even if they tell themselves it is only in fun." He made another note. "There is talk," he said slowly, "of quarrels between Sir Lionel and the deceased, over property. There is also, quite unofficially, a suggestion of some, understanding between Mr. Hargreaves and Miss Reed. I will ask you to keep that to yourselves." "Of course," said Miss Marple, with the profound discretion of a woman who has carried more serious scandals in her knitting bag. As the inspector left, Mrs. Weatherby turned to her eagerly. "There now, Jane. Sir Lionel and the schoolteacher. It all fits. Passion and property. I always said—" Miss Marple, however, was not listening. Her mind had returned to the doll's house, and to a small, easily overlooked detail which had troubled her even at the time. It was not the figure on the floor, nor the tiny paper knife in the miniature hand. It was something much humbler, altogether domestic. And in Miss Marple's experience, it was often the little domestic things that showed where real wickedness had crept in. Inspector Craddock arrived just after 4 o'clock, his car sending up an indignant flurry of gravel as it swung into the drive of the Laurels. The police in Much Benham had done what they could, but a dead man in a locked study and a poisoned glass of sherry had quickly been declared a matter for the Yard, as Mrs. Price Ridley informed the High Street with gloomy satisfaction. Miss Marple, who had accepted a lift back to the village from Mrs. Bantry, had not intended to go out again. She had taken off her hat, straightened one or two little drawers in her sitting room. One could always think better, she found, when one's belongings were in order, and was in the pool about act of counting her knitting stitches when the telephone rang. It was Dolly Bantry, of course. "My dear, you must come. Craddock's here, yes, that Craddock, and he's asking all sorts of questions. He's being quite obtuse, says it's perfectly simple. You know what that means." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple. "I am afraid it generally means it is not simple at all." "Exactly. I shall send the car. No arguments. And bring that awful white shawl. You always look particularly harmless in it." 10 minutes later, suitably wrapped and looking as though she had been roused from a peaceful doze, Miss Marple was ushered once more into the drawing-room at the Laurels. Inspector Craddock, who had encountered her on a former occasion and had been left with uncomfortable memories of how very wrong he had been, rose with a respect that he attempted to conceal. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Didn't expect, to see so much of me, Inspector," said Miss Marple, her blue eyes very mild. "I assure you I feel quite the trespasser, but one must support poor dear Dolly. She is quite unstrung." Dolly, who looked anything but unstrung, snorted faintly, but subsided onto a sofa in obedience to a quelling glance from Miss Marple. "I was just going over the main points with Mr. Latimer," said Craddock, nodding toward Gerald Latimer, who stood by the mantelpiece, pale and rather too carefully composed. "Perhaps you could repeat what you told me, sir." Gerald smoothed his hair. "It is really very straightforward. I left my uncle in his study shortly before 3. He was in his usual health. Perhaps a trifle irritable, but that was not uncommon. He had his sherry." His eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, toward Miss Phelps, the housekeeper, who sat bolt upright in a chair, her hands clenched on her black apron. "I went out for a walk. When I returned at 3:30, I found him, like that." "And the study door was locked?" Craddock prompted. "Yes. I fetched Miss Phelps. We had to send for Jim, the gardener, to force it open. The glass was on the desk, still half full. The doctor says it was poison. Digitalis, wasn't it, Doctor?" Dr. Haydock, who had just come in and was warming his hands at the fire, grunted. "Very like Digitalis. Heart stimulant in the right dose, heart stopper in the wrong. I'll know for certain after the post-mortem." "Which only leaves," said Craddock, with an air of reluctant conclusion, "the question of how the poison got into the glass. And that, Miss Phelps tells me, is easily answered. She poured the sherry." Miss Phelps turned a chalky white. I poured it, yes, as I always do. But I didn't put anything in it. I set it on the tray with the decanter, like I've done for 10 years and more. I never touched the glass again." "But no one else went into the study before Mr. Latimer?" Craddock persisted. "You're sure of that?" "I'm sure I didn't see anyone," Miss Phelps said doggedly. "And I passed the door twice, going to and from the kitchen. If anyone had gone in, I'd have heard the latch. It squeaks." "A squeaking latch," murmured Miss Marple, half to herself. "Such things are often very useful. I remember in Little Cotsley—" Craddock gave her a wary look. "Yes, Miss Marple." "Oh, nothing, nothing," she said placidly. "It is only that in Little Cotsley there was a very curious case of a young man who was most improperly devoted to his employer's wife. A latch, you see, that did not squeak when it ought to have done, was of the greatest importance. Here it appears to squeak very reliably. Most reassuring." Gerald Latimer gave a short, nervous laugh. Miss Marple watched him, noting the way his fingers worried at the edge of his cuff, the quick, furtive glance he sent toward the door, as though wishing himself elsewhere. "And this, Doll's House, I think you called it?" Craddock asked suddenly. "I was told there was some, unusual feature." It was Mrs. Bantry who answered, her eyes alight with the scandalous thrill of it. "Oh, you must see it, Craddock. It's the most extraordinary thing. In the nursery, of all places. A little man lying dead on the floor with a tiny glass beside him. Just like poor Mr. Latimer in his study. It's really quite horrid. Practically a model of the crime, said Dr. Haydock grimly. Long before the crime happened. That's the nasty part. Miss Marple's knitting lay very still in her lap. She thought of the tiny, broken ladder in the doll's house, the miniature sherry bottle so carelessly placed near the nursery window. Someone had rehearsed the idea of this death, made a little stage of it where no one would think to look closely, because it was only a toy. Who, she asked gently, has the most reason to play with such a toy, I wonder? It was perhaps characteristic of St. Mary Mead that by the following afternoon the tragedy at the Laurels had already settled into a pattern of domestic routine. The morning's excitement, Sergeant Abel coming out of the house with a notebook, Mrs. Cartwright weeping ostentatiously at her garden gate, young Tommy Jenkins declaring to anyone who would listen that he had seen a suspicious motor car, had given way to the quieter pleasure of discussing it all over properly brewed tea. Miss Marple, who rarely allowed anything to interfere with her tea, was pouring for herself when the garden gate clicked and a familiar, precise step sounded on the path. A moment later, Inspector Craddock was shown in by Florence, who had all the air of ushering a duke rather than a CID man. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," he began, glancing almost wistfully at the teapot. "Not in the least, Inspector. There is nothing so restorative as a cup of tea after hearing about a murder." "Or so I have found," said Miss Marple gently. "Won't you?" Craddock accepted. It was not his first encounter with Miss Marple, and he had learned, more quickly than some of his colleagues, that behind the pink shawl, white hair, and mild blue eyes lurked Anton. Intelligence he would have been glad to find in several of his sergeants. "We've had the doctor's preliminary report," he said presently. "Death between 4:30 and 5 o'clock yesterday. Sharp, heavy blow. No sign of the weapon yet." He paused. "You were good enough to tell Sergeant Abel that you found the, body." Miss Marple inclined her head. Poor Miss Ellsworth. She looked very peaceful, except, of course, for the dreadful wound. The position of the head was quite wrong. One notices such little things when one has seen a good many people in bed. Illnesses, you know. Craddock's eyes sharpened. "Wrong? In what way, Miss Marple?" "Well, my dear Inspector, if a person has simply fallen, one expects a certain untidiness. Sprawling limbs, displacement, but Miss Ellsworth was almost neatly arranged, and the book by her side was open at a very curious place. The page was upside down." "You think it was placed there?" "I should not like to say positively, only it reminded me very much of old Mr. Lister, who used to pretend to fall asleep over the newspaper when his wife came into the room. The paper was always upside down. He did not really read, poor man, but he wished to appear as though he had been doing something proper." Craddock smiled in spite of himself. "We've been working on the assumption that whoever struck the blow surprised her while she was in bed resting. She was heard quarreling earlier, you know." "Yes," said Miss Marple. Her needles clicked twice and were still. "With Mr. Markham?" "We've taken a statement from him," Craddock went on. "He says he left shortly after 4, walked straight back to the inn. Landlady confirms he arrived there before past, and never went out again. Our times fit, but just barely. It leaves him possible, but not comfortable. And there are others." "There are always others," Miss Marple observed. "Human beings are very unoriginal in their motives. Money, love, fear, and a desire to conceal. Those are the usual things. Though, of course, they dress themselves up very differently, like the little figures in a doll's house." Craddock frowned. The doll's house again. The niece, Angela, seemed quite upset that you insisted on seeing it." It upset her?" Miss Marple's voice was innocent. "Well, she said you were prying, her word, though I don't see that there's anything particularly prying about looking at a child's toy." "It depends how the toy is arranged," murmured Miss Marple. "Did you notice, Inspector, that in the little nursery, the doll representing Miss Ellsworth was lying on the bed in precisely the same position in which we found her aunt?" "I noticed you were looking at it very intently," said Craddock. "I thought perhaps you were admiring the workmanship." Angela told me she'd copied her aunt's bedroom exactly, down to the pattern on the curtains. "Children are great copiers," said Miss Marple. "They copy mannerisms, turns of phrase, actions. Sometimes they copy things they have not been meant to see. It is very enlightening." Craddock stared. "You mean the child may have seen the— Good Lord, Miss Marple, that would be a shock for any youngster." "Children see more than we suppose," Miss Marple replied. "Angela is not a very young child, Inspector, and she was extremely angry with her aunt. One must always remember that anger in a child is much more intense than in grown people. There is less control over expression." "You aren't suggesting— Oh, dear me, no," Miss Marple interrupted calmly. "It is very seldom a child, however much they may wish someone dead. No, I was only thinking that if Angela's dollhouse shows us the crime, it may also show us the criminal. Children tend to put themselves in, even when they do not mean to." Craddock drained his cup slowly. "You believe there is something, some detail, in that doll's house which doesn't fit?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that there is something which fits a little too well. Accuracy is often the enemy of truth. May I ask, Inspector, who else has had free access to Angela's little house since yesterday?" "The family, certainly, the maid." "Dr. Field, when he went upstairs?" "Myself. Sergeant Abel." "Why?" Miss Marple's eyes rested placidly on the pink and white roses in her best china cup. "Because, my dear Inspector, if one wishes to alter the appearance of a crime without moving a body, the next best thing is to alter its reflection. And that, you see, is quite a different matter." It was, in fact, a very small thing that set Miss Marple thinking in quite a new direction. She had gone home after tea with Mrs. Price Ridley, carrying with her a plentiful harvest of village surmise and, more usefully, one or two unguarded remarks that had slipped out. Among the condemnations of the younger generation and the lamentations about the decline of standards, she made herself a cup of very weak tea. "At my age," she would say, "one drinks tea for comfort, not stimulation," and set it down beside her as she took from her knitting basket the tiny scrap of paper she had retrieved almost absent-mindedly. It was crumpled and faintly scented with something sharp and modern, the sort of perfume Miss Marple associated with serious young women who worked in offices and did not marry quite so quickly as their mothers. There was only half a sentence in a rapid, pointed hand. "Can't go on. The doll's house will have to—" Miss Marple frowned a little, not from shock, but in the same way she might frown at a miscounted row of knitting. People, in her experience, very seldom said that things could not go on, unless there was some element of drama in their nature. Yet the unfinished phrase, and its curious reverence, suggested something more than mere temperament. She replaced the scrap carefully, then went to her bureau and took out, with an air of gentle absent-mindedness, the little notebook in which she occasionally jotted down the salient points of village happenings. She was not methodical. She would have been the first to admit that, but the habit of making a note of this or that had grown upon her over the years as a hedge against the frailties of memory. She wrote now in her firm, old-fashioned script, "Note, reference to doll's house as leverage or Whodunit." Who used the phrase "can't go on" when speaking of arrangements? Check conversations, garden party, previous week at vicarage, etc. Her mind, clear and unsentimental, moved over the events of the last 2 days. The discovery in the nursery, the stiff embarrassment of Inspector Craddock, the way Mrs. Loring had cried rather too much and rather too prettily for Miss Marple's taste, and the odd silence of young Mr. Giles when the little house had been mentioned. Silence, in Miss Marple's estimation, could be as revealing as any outburst. There came a brisk tap at the door, followed almost immediately by the entrance of Griselda Clement, very handsome in a hat that owed something to London fashion and something more to the vicar's resigned tolerance. "My dear," she said, kissing Miss Marple in an absent, affectionate way, I am in my round of good works. Geoffrey has sent me to look in on you and make sure you are not made quite ill by all this excitement. He seems to imagine you are as fragile as his sermon notes." Miss Marple smiled. "A sermon may be fragile, dear, but I have generally found the paper it's written on exceedingly tough. Pray sit down. Is there anything new?" Griselda's eyes brightened. "My dear Jane, you are quite shameless. Of course there is. Inspector Craddock has been in and out of the vicarage all morning, and I managed to overhear a fragment or two while taking tea in the study. He thinks he has discovered a quarrel, one of those rather nasty, whispered ones, between our unfortunate victim and Mr. Barton. Over money, naturally. It so often is. Money," Miss Marple said gently, "does present very strong temptations. But so, in its way, does pride." Did the inspector seem pleased? "Positively pleased with himself. He is rather taking to you, you know. He said you had drawn his attention to that curious alteration in the doll's house stair carpet, the bit that doesn't quite match. I suppose he thinks you noticed it by accident." "Very likely," said Miss Marple. "Men in authority are happier so. It spares them the necessity of readjusting their view of the world. Did Mr. Barton deny the quarrel?" "Oh, he denied everything. Looked quite pale and shaken, according to Geoffrey. But then he would, wouldn't he? He's the sort who always looks guilty when asked the simplest question. A bad conscience, I dare say." Miss Marple, recalling a little boy in St. Mary Mead long ago who had looked equally guilty whenever his school books were mentioned, and who had in fact been concealing, not stolen, sweet but a pathetic, hopeless love letter to the curate's pretty niece, did not entirely agree. Guilt, in her view, was a very different thing from fear. "I wonder," she said softly. "Not every man who trembles has done the deed, you know. Sometimes he has only had the imagination to picture it very clearly." Griselda shivered, though the room was warm. "You say the most uncomfortable things. Geoffrey says you are quite on the side of the angels, but I'm not always sure which angels he means." When she had gone, leaving behind a faint fragrance of good scent and the echo of lively gossip, Miss Marple sat very still. Mr. Barton, then. And money. A possible motive, certainly, and one the inspector would follow with commendable energy. But the words on the scrap of paper tugged at her mind. "Can't go on. The doll's house will have to what? Be sold? Be destroyed? Be used?" It was curious, all the same, that the only absolutely certain thing about the crime was its deliberate staging within that miniature house. The placement that echoed real room, real habits. That did not, Miss Marple thought, speak of money primarily. It spoke of something remembered very closely, perhaps resented, some small cruelty or humiliation, nursed over years. One did not arrange such tableau without an intimate, almost childish vindictiveness. "Someone," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "has been playing with toys for far too long." Her eyes, suddenly bright, went to the clock. There was one person in the village who might throw a little more light upon childish games, if one asked in quite the right way. It was time, Miss Marple decided, to pay a call upon the very talkative, very observant Miss Kitty Brent, who had been governess in 3 quite different households, and whose Miss Marple well knew, had once presided over a nursery in which a certain, very elaborate doll's house had been the pride and joy. Miss Marple stood very still, the tiny sodden garment resting in the palm of her gloved hand. Above her, a rook cawed harshly from the bare branch of an ash, its cry echoing across the quiet water. She had, over the years, learned to pay particular attention when something appeared to be merely theatrical. Human wickedness, she had observed, often dressed itself up in little plays, hoping that the audience would pay more attention to the costume than to the actor. A doll's coat, ordered from a theatrical costumier in London. A doll's house murder scene prepared in advance. A dead man who had been on the point of changing his will. A widow whose initials were discreetly sewn into a miniature garment that was now being disposed of in the river. It was not proof, of course. Miss Marple was always very strict with herself on that point, but it was a direction. And as she carefully folded the coat into a handkerchief and tucked it away in her reticule, she thought of something else. A housekeeper hurrying from the direction of the wall. River with a bulging handbag. Mrs. Bantry, with her anxious eyes and muddy shoes, might not be the orchestrator of anything, but she could very well be the unwilling accomplice. She made her way back towards the manor slowly, stopping once or twice to rest on convenient stiles. To anyone watching, she was only an elderly lady who tired easily and liked to sit. In truth, her mind traveled much faster than her feet. By the time she reached the great front door of Blackwood Manor, she had decided precisely whom she needed to see first. It was Ellen, the maid, who let her in, her eyes rimmed pink from crying and lack of sleep. "Oh, miss," she said, "they're all in such a state. Inspector Craddock is fair tearing his hair out. He's shut himself in the study with Mr. Julian." "That must be very trying for the inspector," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "Such a handsome young man, Mr. Julian, but I dare say not always the most moderate of tempers. I wonder, my dear, might I have a word with Mrs. Bantry?" "Only about some household matters. At my age, one is always looking for a reliable laundress." Ellen hesitated. "She said she had a headache, miss. She's gone to lie down." "How very sensible of her. Might I take her up a little lavender water? I always find it a comfort." Miss Marple smiled, the picture of harmless benevolence. After a moment, Ellen relented and led her upstairs. Mrs. Bantry's room was small, neat, and smelled faintly of starch and carbolic soap. The housekeeper herself was sitting on the edge of her bed, not lying down at all, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her handbag lay open on the chair beside her, empty. "Oh," she exclaimed, jumping to her feet. "I didn't expect—" "I am so sorry to intrude, Mrs. Bantry," Miss Marple said gently. "I brought you a little something." She set the lavender bottle on the washstand. Nerves can be so difficult at a time like this. Mrs. Bantry's eyes filled with sudden tears. "I can't bear it, Miss Marple. Police everywhere, asking questions, looking at me as if I might have put poison in the master's tea. I never touched it, I swear." "I am quite sure you did not," Miss Marple said with quiet conviction. "If you had, you would not be sitting there looking as though you had the weight of the world on your shoulders. No, you are distressed about something else. Something you have done since the unhappy event." The housekeeper stared at her, lips trembling. "I don't know what you mean. People often carry burdens they think are theirs alone," Miss Marple went on, as if musing to herself. "Why, I remember in St. Mary Mead, when little Annie Briggs helped her brother hide the butcher's missing takings under the duck pond. She had nightmares for weeks, poor child, though she hadn't stolen a penny. It's a dreadful thing, being made to get rid of something for someone else, isn't it? Especially when that something is not of your own making." Mrs. Bantry flinched as though struck, her hands twisted together. "I didn't want to," she burst out. "But she said I'd be turned out without a character if I refused. And at my age, where would I go?" Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "She, do you mean Mrs. Fortescue?" The housekeeper gave a terrified little nod, then shook her head quickly as if trying to deny it. "I never said— You mustn't— I only took a box to the river, that's all." "A little wooden box from the nursery. She said it was broken toys, fit for nothing. How was I to know? Broken toys often tell very interesting stories," Miss Marple said, "even when they have been dressed up in new clothes." Downstairs at that very moment, Inspector Craddock was concluding a fruitless interview with Julian Fortescue. As the young man stormed out of the study in a temper, Craddock ran a hand through his thinning hair and muttered, "If I don't get something solid soon, I'll be forced to charge. The wrong man, just to keep the chief happy." He did not yet know that the solid thing he required was already folded neatly in Miss Marple's handkerchief, and that upstairs, frightened housekeeper had just taken the first trembling step towards shattering the careful illusion that someone in Blackwood Manor had so artfully constructed. Miss Marple did not touch the bundle again. Its presence seemed enough to draw the truth from Mrs. Bantry like water from a spring. "You found it in Miss Sylvia's room," she repeated quietly, "and instead of taking it to Inspector Craddock, you carried it to the river and tried to throw it away. Why, Mrs. Bantry." The housekeeper twisted her apron in her hands. "Because nothing good ever comes of the police poking around in young ladies' rooms, that's why. I remember the scandal with poor Emily Torrance and that dreadful business with the letters. They never forget the law. I thought it must be some foolish thing between the ladies. A row. Jealousy, maybe." She lowered her voice, though they were quite alone. "Miss Sylvia and Mrs. Fortescue haven't been easy with each other of late." Sharp words, doors shut hard enough to shake the frames. Miss Marple nodded, storing that away. "And how did you know the coat belonged to a doll and not, say, a child's toy from long ago?" Mrs. Bantry sniffed. "Because of the box, miss. That little fancy box that came from London. I saw it on Mrs. Fortescue's dressing table the day after. Empty it was, but the label said Lansbury and Pike Costumier, Miniature Wardrobe Division. And in her waste paper basket there was tissue and a little card. Lydia, as requested, another set. Full mourning, L&P. Another set, mind you. So when I saw that tiny coat in Miss Sylvia's drawer, with those same fine stitches, I knew it wasn't from any old nursery trunk." "Another set," Miss Marple murmured. "How very industrious of them. So there had been other outfits before this one? For dolls?" "They've all been shut away in that doll's house," Mrs. Bantry said miserably. "Mrs. Fortescue wouldn't let anyone touch it. She said it was sentimental, her mother's, or some such. But about a fortnight ago, she had me dust every room inside it. Every tiny room. Said there mustn't be a speck of dirt for what's coming. I thought she meant the garden party." The housekeeper shuddered. "It gives me the chills now, thinking of it." A heavy step sounded in the passage. Mrs. Bantry sprang guiltily to her feet, but it was only Ellen the maid, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. "They've taken Whalbus." "Julian," she blurted, "in handcuffs like a common thief. And Mrs. Fortescue's in her room. She's fainted, they say. Dr. Hargreaves is with her." "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all wrong. I know it is." Miss Marple rose, her expression grave but composed. "Ellen, my dear, hysteria never improved a situation. Did you see Mr. Julian when they took him?" "Yes," Ellen sniffed. "He was shouting that someone had put the tin in his bag. He kept saying he'd only touched the clubs that morning when Mr. Fortescue's lawyer came, and he went out after, to the village. He said he'd never even opened the side pocket." The lawyer was here this morning." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "That is interesting." "Mr. Dalrymple," Ellen nodded. "Tall, thin gentleman, arrived just after breakfast. They were shut up in the study for near an hour. Mr. Dalrymple left looking as if he'd swallowed a wasp." Miss Marple thanked the girl and stepped out into the corridor. The house thrummed with upset. Muted sobs, doors opening and closing. The distant rumble of Craddock's voice upstairs. She moved with her usual unhurried pace toward the main staircase, her thoughts turning over like the pages of a well-loved detective novel. Lydia ordering doll-sized mourning clothes ahead of her husband's death. A doll's coat with her initials found hidden in Sylvia's room. Mrs. Bantry risking much to dispose of it. Julian framed with implausible clumsiness. A lawyer arriving the very morning after the registered letter about the will. And centrally, that doll's house, cleaned, curated, prepared for what's coming. At the turn of the staircase, she paused. Raised voices drifted down from the upper landing. Inspector Craddock, angry now, and another, cooler tone, Mr. Dalrymple's, she guessed. Then, cutting through, a sharp cry from the far end of the corridor where the nursery wing lay. It was Sylvia. Miss Marple, despite her age, moved quicker than anyone would have believed. She reached the nursery to find the door wide open. Sylvia standing in the center of the room, white as chalk, one hand pressed to her mouth. On the little table beside the doll's house lay a single object. A new doll, dressed in a miniature prison uniform, a tiny rope coiled beside it. Propped against the house was a note, printed in careful block letters to disguise the hand. For the next one who meddles. Miss Marple felt every eye in the crowded corridor shift toward her, as if expecting an explanation. She only looked at the doll, her face unreadable, and thought, very quietly to herself, that the murderer had just made a serious mistake. They had announced, in their own grotesque fashion, that the game was far from over. Miss Marple did not confront Lydia Fortescue directly. That was not her way. Instead, she asked to see Inspector Craddock, and after some effort found him in the study, frowning over the late Arthur Fortescue's desk. Papers were spread out before him. Letters, bank statements, the inevitable jumble of a busy man's life. Julian had been taken to the station, but not formally charged. Craddock, though apparently satisfied with his theory, still bore the look of a man nagged by a faint, unacknowledged doubt. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, closing the door behind her, "may I trespass upon a little more of your time? I believe there is a discrepancy you ought to see." Craddock sighed. "Miss Marple, with respect, this is a police matter." "Quite," she agreed, "and I am only an elderly woman with no authority whatsoever. But I have observed that when a household keeps dolls and a dollhouse, Inspector, they often reveal more truth than the people who own them." He stared at her. "Is this about that wretched toy again?" Miss Marple moved to the desk, resting her gloved hand lightly on its edge. "You found arsenic in Julian's golf bag, but there was also a second bottle, one that smelled of bitter almonds, which Mrs. Bantry, in her foolish loyalty, threw into the river. That bottle, Inspector, was hidden with a doll's coat bearing Mrs. Fortescue's initials. 2 poisons, 2 hiding places, 2 separate narratives. Does that not strike you as elaborate?" Craddock's eyes sharpened. "You're saying someone staged one method of murder to conceal another?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that the arsenic is not the main performance. It is a prop, and a clumsy one at that. The real method, I suspect, was rather quicker. Mr. Fortescue spilled his drink, did he not? And his collapse, you told us, was very sudden. Arsenic is rarely so obliging." Craddock stared at the papers without seeing them. "But the doctors, dear Inspector, are no less fallible than vicars or postmistresses," Miss Marple said kindly, "especially if someone has thoughtfully provided misleading evidence. You have been presented with a story. Quarrelsome nephew, gambling debts, convenient poison. It is all very theatrical. And Mrs. Fortescue, you may be interested to know, received a parcel from a theatrical costumier days before the murder. A parcel the size of a doll." Craddock exhaled slowly. "You believe Lydia Fortescue is our woman?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that she is our director. But even the cleverest director occasionally forgets that props must be disposed of consistently. There is reddish river clay on her sleeve, Inspector. The same clay I found on the doll's coat that was not meant to be discovered." Something in Craddock's expression shifted. He picked up his hat. "What do you suggest?" "That you permit me," said Miss Marple, "one indulged whim. Call the household together in the nursery. If Mrs. Fortescue has staged her masterpiece using her beloved dollhouse, it is only fitting that the final act should also take place there. Murderers, in my experience, have a fatal attachment to their own arrangements." It did not take long for the summons to travel through the house. Servants came reluctantly, wiping anxious hands on aprons. Sylvia entered pale, her eyes rimmed red. Lydia Fortescue arrived last, serene and composed, though her lips tightened ever so slightly when she realized the gathering point. The nursery was filled with a peculiar high, childlike stillness. The dollhouse stood on its table, doors closed, its perfect facade turned toward them all like a smug, miniature witness. Miss Marple took her place by it, resting one hand lightly on its roof. "I have always thought," she began mildly, "that houses tell us quite as much as people do. And dollhouses, being an exaggeration of real life, tell us more. Every little detail speaks. A chair moved, a curtain half drawn, a tiny coat hidden where it should not be." Lydia gave a brittle little laugh. "Really, Miss Marple, is this some sort of village entertainment? Because if so, I must say your timing is atrocious." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, and now her eyes were very bright indeed, "I believe the timing is precisely what will interest us most. You see, Mrs. Fortescue, you were quite right when you told Inspector Craddock that you value order above all, that in the end is what will hang you." The room seemed to freeze around those words. Even the dolls in their painted faces appeared to stare. Miss Marple opened the front of the dollhouse with delicate care, as though she were opening the curtains on a stage. Miss Marple did not at once go in search of Inspector Craddock. She had learned long ago that policemen, like wayward choir boys, responded better to fait accompli than to gentle suggestion. First, there was one small experiment she needed to conduct, what she always thought of privately as the last little nudge. She asked Sylvia, very quietly, to send a message to Lydia Fortescue. Miss Marple would be grateful if Mrs. Fortescue could spare a few moments in the nursery to help straighten the dolls and their little house, which must be such a sad reminder. There was hardly a woman in England, Miss Marple reflected, who could resist the temptation to tidy a scene she believed she had staged to perfection. The nursery was dim in the late afternoon light, dust motes swirling lazily, as if the room itself had chosen to forget the horror it had hosted. The doll's house still stood on its central table, doors open, parlor exposed, the tiny replica of Arthur Fortescue sprawled on its miniature carpet. Miss Marple had made one small alteration. Beside the male doll she had placed another, hastily dressed in the damp velvet coat from a knitting bag. Its monogram, carefully turned outward. Lydia Fortescue entered with a briskness that jarred against the room's childish decor. She stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple, then composed her face into a mask of tender sorrow. "Such a dreadful business," she murmured, glancing at the doll's house. "I suppose the inspector has been here again. He seems determined to wring meaning from a child's toy." "Ah, but toys can tell us such a lot, don't you think?" Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Children act out what they see, and sometimes adults do the same, only with more elaborate props. I took the liberty of adding a character to your little tableau. Do you approve?" Lydia's gaze drifted unwillingly to the velvet-coated doll. For a fraction of a second, her breath hitched. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. Then, very deliberately, she relaxed it. "It seems out of place," she said coolly. "Arthur never wore velvet." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But you did, I fancy, when you played the queen in the village pageant. Such a beautiful costume. I was reminded of it when I saw the monogram. So very like yours." Lydia's eyes flicked toward Miss Marple, quick and sharp as a blade. "You are overreaching yourself, Miss Marple. A monogram on a doll's coat? It proves nothing." "Oh, I shouldn't dream of trying to prove anything," Miss Marple replied gently. "I leave proof to the police. I'm more interested in, shall we say, casting. Who chose which doll should die here, in this little parlor? Who rehearsed the scene in miniature before the performance?" Lydia took a step closer to the doll's house, her face drawn, fascinated despite herself. "Who? Some morbid prankster. My husband made people unhappy, Miss Marple. It is not surprising that someone expressed their hatred childishly. But hatred usually strikes directly," Miss Marple said. This is vanity. A need to direct, to arrange, to show one's cleverness. Very like a stage manager, perhaps, who orders everyone to their marks. The silence between them stretched. Then Miss Marple, as if struck by a thought, added softly, "They have found the arsenic, you know. in Julian's golf bag, Inspector Craddock is exceedingly pleased. He is prepared to swear to a jury that Julian is the murderer. It is all so very simple. The words hung in the air. Miss Marple watched Lydia steadily, like an old cat watching a much younger one decide whether to pounce or to flee. Lydia's composure flickered. Anger, scorn, something like panic. "Julian," she said slowly, "has the brains of a spoiled puppy. If you or the inspector imagine he could have conceived all this—" She stopped abruptly, realization dawning that she had confessed more than she intended. "Or what, Mrs. Fortescue?" Miss Marple asked, her voice infinitely kind. "The poison in the study decanter, the doll in the nursery, prepared hours before, the key left on the hall table so anyone might seem guilty, the little velvet coat hidden in Sylvia's room with a bottle that smelled of bitter almonds." Lydia turned very pale. For the first time, she looked like a woman in mourning. Only it was not for her husband, but for her own inviolable sense of control. "You have been very busy, Miss Marple," she whispered. "Merely tidying up," Miss Marple said, "as you like to do." There was a knock at the door, abrupt and official. Inspector Craddock entered, his expression impatient, until he saw Lydia's face and the two dolls on the miniature carpet. Something in the tableau and in Miss Marple's steady gaze made him pause on the threshold. "I think, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Mrs. Fortescue has misunderstood the nature of her audience. Word count, 596. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Craddock, regaining his official manner, shut the nursery door behind him with a soft click that sounded curiously final. "I'm not sure what game is being played here," he said stiffly, "but I have a suspect in custody and physical evidence." "Indeed you do," Miss Marple agreed. "Physical evidence which was planted with great care, precisely so that you would find it. You were meant to arrest Julian. That was part of the script." Lydia gave a short, bitter laugh. "You are mad, both of you. Do you imagine I ran about the house sprinkling poison like confetti?" "Oh no," Miss Marple said. "You would never do anything so crude. You prefer indirection? For instance, you arranged the doll's house scene before the murder. You ordered a special doll's costume from a theatrical costumier in London. Was that not so? Mrs. Gable at the post office was quite clear on the matter. The slightest widening of Lydia's eyes confirmed it. You staged the tableau hours ahead, knowing Arthur would drink from that decanter later." Miss Marple went on. "You left the doll in the exact position you intended his body to occupy. That was not hatred, Mrs. Fortescue. That was artistry. You admired your own cleverness." Craddock frowned. "You're suggesting premeditation of the coldest kind. But where's the proof she handled the poison?" "In her own words," Miss Marple said gently, "she went down to the study with a headache before her husband came in. The housekeeper saw her. At that time the room was empty. How very convenient to lace the decanter then. No one to see." Lydia's lips curled. "And your talk of cyanide? Bitter almonds? You are inventing shadows." "Oh, but that is the most fascinating part," Miss Marple replied serenely. "You planned arsenic for Arthur. Slow, undramatic, easily passed off as natural illness. But someone else in the house planned something rather different, didn't they? Someone who found a little velvet coat with your initials hidden behind a mirror, together with a bottle that once held cyanide. If Mrs. Bantry had not panicked and thrown it in the river, the inspector would have believed that Sylvia, poor, frightened Sylvia, meant to kill you." Craddock stared. "Kill Mrs. Fortescue?" Miss Marple nodded. "Sylvia was desperate. She believed you meant to disinherit her, Mrs. Fortescue. She spoke of it in the garden, but she is not clever enough to carry through such wickedness. She obtained the poison. Youth is foolish. But she hesitated. You discovered her little scheme, did you not? And you turned it to your own advantage." Lydia's hands gripped the back of a nursery chair until the knuckles showed white. You cannot know that. But I can, Miss Marple said softly, because you used that knowledge to design your masterpiece. 2 poisons, 2 supposed killers. Sylvia to be unmasked as a silly, jealous girl with cyanide. Julian as a reckless gambler hiding arsenic. Either would have done. You scattered suspicion like breadcrumbs. Meanwhile, poor Arthur obediently played his part and died on cue. Craddock exhaled sharply. The key, he said suddenly, left on the hall table where anyone could take it. You lied about that as well. You wanted whoever fetched it to seem guilty. Exactly, Miss Marple agreed. Julian admitted prowling the nursery wing, searching for bonds he believed his uncle had hidden. Naturally, he would take the key to the doll's house if it helped him look for valuables. That made him a deal as your principal suspect. You relied on the inspector's very proper belief in physical evidence. Lydia's face had hardened into something mask-like, but her eyes glittered with a horrible, brittle pride. And if I did, she said in a low voice, if I rid myself of a cruel, pompous man who delighted in holding the purse strings of this entire household, who threatened daily to cast us all aside in favor of some charity, if I turned his own malice against him as neatly as arranging figures in a doll's house, what then, Miss Marple? Do you expect me to weep? Miss Marple sighed, the sound old and infinitely sad. No, Mrs. Fortescue, she said. I have lived too long to expect tears where there is only vanity. But you made one mistake. You thought people were puppets. In my experience, they are much more like children. They blunder. They hide things badly. They talk when they should be silent. Your stage was never as tidy as you believed. Too many little hands disturbed your scenery. Craddock stepped forward, his voice now very formal. Mrs. Lydia Fortescue, I must ask you to accompany me to the station. You are not obliged to say anything, but... Lydia straightened, every inch the imperious hostess. There will be no need for melodrama, Inspector. I shall come quietly. It appears my performance is at an end. She glanced once at the doll's house, at the 2 tiny bodies on the carpet. The husband she'd killed and the version of herself she had tried to erase. For the first time, a flicker of something like horror crossed her face, as if she saw not a tableau, but a confession rendered in miniature. After they had gone, Miss Marple remained alone in the nursery. She gently set the velvet-coated doll upright and closed the little front of the house, shutting away its terrible scene. In the weeks that followed, Oakhaven returned to its accustomed rhythms, though the gossip in the post office and at the grocer's would, for many years, circle back to the murder in the doll's house. Julian was released, paler and chastened, his debts quietly settled by a distant cousin who insisted he take a modest position in a London firm. Sylvia, after a spell with an aunt by the sea, grew softer around the eyes and more practical in her ambitions, and eventually married a quiet curate who had never owned a doll's house in his life. As for Miss Marple, she went back to St. Desault, Mary Mead, where the violets needed thinning and the vicar's wife wished to consult her about the seating plan for a charity concert. Sometimes, when she sat by her window with her knitting, her mind would drift to that perfect little house at Blackwood Manor and to the woman who had mistaken human beings for toys. It is a dangerous thing, she reflected, picking up a dropped stitch, to forget that people are not made of wood and paint, but of fear and hope and foolishness. They will not remain where you put them. They wriggle. And with that, Miss Marple counted her stitches, satisfied that, at least in her own small pattern, every thread had finally run where it ought. The door of the library closed softly behind Inspector Craddock and his prisoner, and a hush fell over Blackwood Manor. A strange, hollow quiet, as if the house itself were catching its breath after the final curtain. Outside, the police cuss engine coughed to life, then faded down the drive. Inside, in the wake of Lydia Fortescue's carefully cultivated composure, shattering under Miss Marple's calm recital of events, something tight and invisible seemed to loosen. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Sylvia sat very straight on the edge of an armchair, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles showed white. Julian, still slightly dazed from having had guilt and then innocence thrust upon him in the course of an afternoon, leaned against the mantelpiece as if it were the only solid object in the room. Mrs. Bantry hovered uncertainly by the door, her apron twisted between nervous fingers. Even the doll's house, illuminated by the failing light from the tall windows, seemed to watch with its tiny blank windows. Miss Marple, who had remained sitting throughout the final confrontation, bent to retrieve her knitting bag, which had somehow ended up beneath the side table. Her movements were unhurried. Only the faintest tremor in her hand, quickly mastered, betrayed the strain of the last hours. "It is most distressing," she said gently, as if commenting on an overbaked pudding rather than attempted multiple murder, "to see such ingenuity put to such wicked use. Your aunt had a very original mind, Miss Sylvia. It is only a pity she devoted it to stage-managing death." Julian gave a shaky, mirthless laugh. "You make it sound almost artistic, Miss Marple." "In a sense it was," Miss Marple replied. "You see, Mrs. Fortescue was not content with simple poisoning. That would have been too crude, too ordinary. No, she wished to create an illusion, an intricate piece of theater in which everyone played their part exactly as she dictated. The arsenic in your golf bag, Mr. Julian. The cyanide traced by implication to Sylvia. The dollhouse tableau suggesting a morbid warning from someone's unseen hand. Each element was placed with the precision of one arranging actors upon a stage." Sylvia shuddered. "And all because Uncle Arthur changed his will, to leave most of the estate to me, and only an allowance to her?" Miss Marple nodded. "It was not only the money, my dear. Money is so often merely the fuel. The true motive tends to be pride or fear. In your aunt's case, it was both. The change in the will told her that, in your uncle's eyes, she had failed in her chosen role as chatelaine, as controller of this little world. She did not intend to be dismissed, either socially or financially." She glanced toward the dollhouse, its miniature rooms still arranged exactly as they had been found, with one significant alteration now exposed. The arrival of that theatrical parcel gave her the opportunity. A new set of dolls, specially made to resemble the household. A tiny Lydia in blue velvet, a tiny Arthur in his grey suit. Two parallel plans, one real, one in miniature. The cyanide bottle and doll's coat hidden in Sylvia's room to frame her if necessary. The scene in the nursery to draw the eye, to suggest a mysterious external enemy, while the true villain played the grieving widow. Mrs. Bantry let out a choked sob. "And I nearly helped her, without knowing, carrying that wretched coat to the river." "You helped prevent an even greater injustice," Miss Marple corrected her kindly. "Your conscience would not let you remain idle once you suspected harm might come to Miss Sylvia. It is often through such small, faltering acts of decency that wickedness is brought to light." The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its solemn notes dispersing the last clinging tatters of Lydia's performance. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed. A maid, no doubt, having just heard the full, breathless account from the kitchen. Julian straightened slowly. "What happens now?" he asked. "To the house, I mean. To us." "Life happens," Miss Marple said, with a soft sigh. "The carpets will be swept, the windows cleaned. Callers will arrive with expressions of solemn sympathy and quite indecent curiosity. In time, the village will speak less of the murder and more of the roses again. But there will always be a faint shadow here, a reminder that even in the prettiest dollhouses, the puppets sometimes pull the strings in quite the wrong direction." Sylvia rose and came to stand beside her, looking down at the tiny manor in its glass case. "I think," she said slowly, "that I shall have the dollhouse put away, or perhaps given to a museum. It feels wrong, somehow, for it to stay." "A very wise decision," Miss Marple agreed. "Children's toys should not be asked to hold such dark secrets. Real houses do that quite well enough." She allowed herself to be helped into her coat, protesting only mildly. As Julian called for the car to take her back to the village, Miss Marple cast one last glance around the room. At the faded portraits, at the fire dying to soft embers, at the dollhouse whose staged drama had mirrored the larger, crueler one. On the drive back to St. Mary Mead, as the hedgerows blurred green and gold in the late light, she folded her hands over her bag and closed her eyes. She was thinking, not of poisons or wills, but of the curious human hunger to arrange and control, to make life behave like a play. It never did, of course. People were forever forgetting that puppets have no hearts, and that real people do. Hearts capable of love and loyalty, but also of the kind of cold, meticulous hatred that can, turn a charming country house into a theater of death. And yet, she reflected, as the spire of St. Mary Mead's church came into view, there was comfort too. For every Lydia Fortescue, there were a dozen Mrs. Bantrys, 100 Sylvia and Julians, muddled and flawed but clinging stubbornly to decency. That, she thought, was why one must go on knitting and tending roses and accepting invitations to dull garden parties. Beneath the worst, there was always something worth preserving. The car turned into the familiar lane. Miss Marple opened her eyes and smiled faintly. She wondered, with a small flicker of curiosity, what new little drama the village would offer next. Not, she hoped, another dollhouse. Once in a lifetime was quite sufficient. They were all assembled in the library, just as they had been on that first dreadful morning. Yet the atmosphere now was taut as a drawn wire. The doll's house, its tiny rooms uncannily still, stood on the side table like a silent witness. Outside, the late afternoon light turned the lawns a muted gold. Inside, Inspector Craddock stood by the hearth with a closed, irritated expression, Julian pale and tight-lipped at one side, Sylvia anxious and watchful, Mrs. Bantry hovering near the door. Lydia Fortescue sat very straight in a high-backed chair, her black mourning perfectly arranged, hands folded with a composure that bordered on defiance. Miss Marple took a moment to settle herself, her knitting bag at her feet, her eyes resting for a fraction of a second on each of them. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried effortlessly to every corner of the room. "I think," she said mildly, "that we may now put Mr. Fortescue's tragic death into its proper order." Craddock gave a short, skeptical sigh. "We already have, Miss Marple. Arsenic in the brandy, arsenic in the leather polish, arsenic in Julian's possession." But that is just the point," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "The arsenic in Julian's possession was never the real method of murder. It was a decoy, a piece of stage business, if you like. Very much in the line of the little scene someone so cleverly set in the doll's house." Her gaze drifted to the miniature study with its tiny armchair in the place where the small effigy of Arthur Fortescue had been found. Lydia shifted almost imperceptibly. "You see," Miss Marple went on, "the doll in the study did not begin as Arthur at all. The tiny blue velvet coat I discovered in the river, with your initials, Mrs. Fortescue, showed that there was another doll, one dressed to represent you. That doll was removed and destroyed once it had served its purpose, and another substituted to suggest a different story entirely." A faint line appeared between Lydia's brows. "This is fanciful, Miss Marple. Dolls and stories, hardly police evidence." "Not fanciful at all," Miss Marple replied, still gentle, "because the story the dolls told was, at first, that you were to be the victim. You arranged that impression yourself. You ordered a specially dressed doll from a theatrical costumier in London 2 days before your husband's death, a doll with your clothing, your initials in the lining, so that, when the dollhouse accidentally came to light, people would believe that you, not your husband, had been the intended target." Sylvia gave a small gasp. Julian stared at his aunt. "But your husband was not yet dead when that doll was placed," Miss Marple continued. "He was merely marked for death. You wanted sympathy, Mrs. Fortescue. A frightened, threatened widow, a woman your husband had perhaps meant to cut out of his will. It would have given you the strongest possible position when the new will was read. The will in which, I understand from the post office, your husband intended to make serious changes. Lydia's voice, when it came, was icy. You are inventing motives, Miss Marple. Not inventing, observing, Miss Marple said. You used 2 poisons. That was your great mistake. The coat in the river had traces of a substance that smelled of bitter almonds. Mrs. Bantry, in her misguided loyalty, threw the little bottle away, but she described it very clearly. Cyanide. Your first plan, I think, was to suggest that someone had tried to poison you quickly and brutally. But cyanide is dramatic. It leaves too little room for improvisation. So when your husband, that same evening, confined himself to his study with his brandy, you changed to something slower and subtler. Arsenic from the greenhouse. Less theatrical, perhaps, but easier to manage. Craddock shifted. You're saying the arsenic was the real murder, and the cyanide only a threat? A rehearsal, Inspector, Miss Marple said. And when it proved inconvenient, it was rewritten. Just as the doll representing Lydia was rewritten into one representing Arthur. Our murderer is very fond of rewriting scenes. Miss Marple turned fully toward Lydia now. You went downstairs at 10:30, while your husband was still in the billiard room. You entered the empty study, doctored the brandy with arsenic, and left everything neat. Later, you retired ostentatiously, having made sure the whole household knew of your headache. You did not need to tamper with locks or windows. You merely relied on habit. Your husband always ended his evening in that chair, with that decanter. And the arsenic in my golf bag? Julian burst out. What about that? Planted, of course, Miss Marple said. After the murder. Lydia knew Inspector Craddock would search methodically. What better than to guide his hand? You, Mr. Julian, had quarreled with your uncle, and you were known to have money troubles. You are untidy, careless. It was entirely in character that incriminating evidence should be found in so obvious and foolish a place. It was a performance designed for the police audience. She looked again at Lydia's sleeve, at that tiny, betraying smear of reddish clay. You walked to the river, Mrs. Fortescue, to dispose of the doll's coat and the cyanide bottle, never imagining that the particular mud on your shoes would contradict your story of a sleepless but motionless night, just as you never imagined that a postmistress would remember your parcel, or that a housekeeper, in trying to shield one girl, would reveal the existence of a hiding place only. A long-time mistress of this house could truly exploit. For a moment, Lydia held herself rigid, every line of her body refusing the accusation. Then something in her seemed to crumble, not dramatically, but with a small, exhausted sigh. He was going to leave it all to them, she said dully, her eyes on Sylvia and Julian. After everything I had done, after all the years, he said I arranged my house like a theater, that nothing in it was real. He was going to dismiss me from my own stage. No, Miss Marple said softly. He was merely going to change the script. It is not the same thing. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his voice brisk, almost gruff to conceal a certain discomfort. Lydia Fortescue, I must ask you to come with me to the station. She rose with surprising dignity. At least, she said coldly, you must admit it was beautifully done. Miss Marple looked at the doll's house, its tiny rooms frozen mid-performance. Beautiful things, Mrs. Fortescue, are meant to delight, she said, not to conceal ugliness. Later, when the police car had gone and the house was quieter, Miss Marple sat alone in the morning room with her knitting. Sylvia came in softly, her face pale but oddly relieved. He really was going to change his will, the girl said, but he wasn't going to cut her out, only make it fairer. If she had only waited. People seldom do wait, Miss Marple replied. That is the tragedy. They hurry to grasp what might have come more gently in time. Outside, the light was fading over Blackwood Manor, and the doll's house, now closed and locked, had been put away. The village would go on talking for months, perhaps years. But gradually, as always, Ordinary life would reclaim its place. Gardens would be tended, letters posted, secrets whispered over shop counters. Miss Marple finished her row, snipped the wool, and folded the small, neat sock into her bag. Human nature, she reflected, was really very much like a doll's house, pretty on the surface, but full of tiny rooms where dangerous thoughts could be carefully arranged. And if one watched quietly enough, from the stalls instead of the stage, one could almost always see the hand that moved the figures. She rose, smoothed her shawl, and went out into the cool evening, quite ready for a simple country supper and perhaps a new pattern to occupy her hands now that this particular piece of deadly needlework was done.